Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 4, or chapter 4, of Little Blue Book number 1127, titled Christianity and Slavery, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1920s something. Okay, let's see. Chapter 4. Where is chapter 4? Page 42. So, page 42, 40, 41. There it is, 42. Chapter 4. Black Slavery. Throughout this essay, I am opposing historical facts to rhetoric. It is easy to argue theoretically in favor of Christianity. Quite certainly, it taught that God was the father of all, and therefore all men were brothers. The orator is rarely aware that the Roman, Greek, Persian, Babylonian, and Egyptian religion had equally taught that God was the father of all. And the Stoics had emphasized that all men were brothers. So his argument is, to him and his hearers, most convincing. Christianity brought into a world of slaves the sublime doctrine of the brotherhood of men. Oh, pardon me. And behold, within a few centuries of the attainment of power by Christianity, slavery was no more. Very simple and persuasive, as long as you refuse to inquire what precise causes ended slavery and what succeeded it. The historical facts make a mockery of all this rhetoric, and we come now to a fact which distresses even the most resolute apologist. I have several times referred to the ingenuity in perverting the truth of Mr. Brace, whose Gesta Christi is understood to be a particularly sober and informed defense of Christianity. But Mr. Brace recoils when the task of justifying the churches in the face of black slavery. It was the most dreadful curse that has perhaps ever afflicted humanity, and the guilt of the great crime rests on the Christian church as an organized body. Because the secular powers expressly consulted the higher clergy as to their right to commit the crime. Let us not exaggerate, even in our confession. Sometimes it is a tricky way of securing pardon. Black slavery was by no means the most dreadful curse that has ever afflicted humanity. During the 300 years that it lasted, it brought unspeakable misery upon millions of Africans. After making every allowance for the humanity of good masters, it was responsible for a mass of suffering comparable with that of the slaves of the Roman Republic. But it was not a worse curse than serfdom, which enslaved almost the whole population of Europe, while popes and bishops were silent during 4 or 5 centuries, and in the case of the largest country, Russia, during 1,000 years. Admitting the second point is an indictment does not annul the first. It would, in fact, be difficult for any apologist above the lowest level of culture and sincerity to acquit Christianity of the guilt of this great crime. It began with the discovery of America. Native labor was at first employed, especially in the West Indies, to extort wealth from the earth for the European conquerors. Feudalism, in other words, was applied to them, but mining in particular proved deadly to them, and the Christian conquerors looked round for a supply of hardier and more profitable labor. The Portuguese then owned a considerable stretch of the African coast, and the suggestion was promptly made that regiments of the African natives of magnificent physique should be employed. It was a Christian bishop, Bartolome de las Casas, who made the suggestion in the interest of the American natives whom he had in charge. But it could be realized only by enslaving the Africans. Black slaves were already well known. African tribes, like the Romans, spared the lives of war captives to make slaves of them. Arab traders took these over and distributed them to Mohammedan lands. Christian visitors to the East had long been familiar with them. The Spanish authorities, who liked the suggestion, consulted the Catholic hierarchy, and that hierarchy betrayed the principles of Jesus once more. On the one hand, they replied with perfect truth that the Church had never condemned slavery. On the other hand, they discovered the most useful truth, that this would enable the Church to baptize and convert immense numbers of the blacks who showed no eagerness for baptism and conversion, and that this eternal gain to the African outweighed all the paltry human advantages of freedom in his native home. So the trade began. Had the Catholic Church, not this or that cleric, but the Catholic Church, either in Spain or Rome, forbidden the traffic, it would never have begun. But popes and archbishops closed their consecrated lips and took their large share of the gold of the Indies. The brotherhood of man is a sublime doctrine. For the use of apologists, practical churchmen forget it from the 4th century to the 19th, when revolution reminded them of it. And the churches were still silent when the greed of the traders led to horrors surpassing those of any ancient slavery. A voyage across the Atlantic was costly and comfortless for all in the 16th and 17th centuries, and so the cheapest vessels were literally packed with the human victims who had been torn from their homes in Africa. Pent up in the stifling holds, terrified at the unknown violence of the sea, they sickened and died in thousands in the course of the voyage. Protestant England is as much involved in the crime as Catholic Spain and Portugal. Between 1680 and 1780, the English possessions in America imported 2,130,000 Africans, and while ultra-pious Spain drafted the treaties of this bloody traffic in the name of the Most Holy Trinity, Captain Hawkins of England gave such names as Jesus to the ships in which these brutalities were perpetuated, and piously served out to his officers and men such maxims as serve God daily and love one another. The callousness of the whole of Christendom to this protracted and abominable outrage is an ironic answer to every claim that religion broke the fetters of the slave. In the year 1760, there were no less than 80,000 black slaves in the city of London itself. It was not until several years after that date that the secular authorities, not the church, forbade slavery in England. France and the other countries were even later in discovering that Jesus had condemned slavery. In 1708, the British Parliament had expressly authorized the traffic. Indeed, Mr. Brace tells us that the British Society for the turning of the page, for the propagation of the gospel in foreign lands, which sent out missionaries to tell the bewildered blacks how superior Protestantism was to Catholicism, had slaves on its own plantations in Barbados, and did not even supply religious instruction to these slaves. Even if we were to admit that Christianity broke the fetters of the slave, at least as regards this modern slavery, any boast on the part of its apologist would be ironic. It would be an insult and an injury to the cotton growers of America as a body to suggest that cruel treatment of the slaves was general amongst them. Moncure D. Conway, who was born in Virginia in 1832 and had vivid personal recollections of the slave-owning days, told me that kind treatment of the slaves was a tradition in his family and in many others. But the traffic had begun, as I said, in the early part of the 16th century, and a record of all the cruelty and brutality from that time to abolition would certainly fill a volume as repulsive as any that could be compiled. Oop, hydrate. Cottonmouth. Ah, take a drink, Maddie. And this crime had been initiated entirely by Christians. After an express consultation of their ministers, and the brutalities were committed entirely by Christians, with the silent approval of every minister in Christendom. 3 centuries of popes, archbishops, and bishops smiled upon the institution. Ancient Roman slavery, about which we hear so much, had actually begun as a humane improvement upon the earlier barbaric practice of cutting the throats of prisoners. It had further been at first devoid of brutality. But this new slavery was deliberately set up by Christian men in a free world, its simple motive being greed, its pretext a piece of hypocrisy, its procedure brutal in the extreme, and its corrupt profit shared by the clergy and the churches themselves. Whether or no a larger sum of cruelty was involved in these 3.5 centuries of black slavery than in ancient Roman slavery, no man can say. But it moves us to ironic laughter when, after this deliberate inauguration of slavery in its worst form in a more enlightened age, we hear Christian apologists boasting that their religion suppressed slavery. The Pope drew too much gold from France and Spain and Portugal to interfere with its tainted sources. The heads of the English Church were too closely allied with the ruling class and the wealthy to remind them of the glorious doctrine of the brotherhood of men. Nor were the non-episcopal Protestant churches which arose toward the close of the period more sensitive to the crime which disgraced their religion. Not only did bishops of the American Episcopal Church in the South own slaves, like any other gentleman, but the Baptists owned 225,000, and the Methodists 250,000 slaves. Pardon me. Every church in the America was paralyzed by a deliberate difference of opinion, in the full light of the 19th century, as to whether the principles of Jesus did or did not involve a condemnation of slavery. Yet in spite of all this, in spite of the silence of every Christian leader in the slave-owning world of 8 centuries after Christ, in spite of the silence of every Christian minister during many farther centuries of serfdom, the glib modern apologist asked us to admire the moral power and effectiveness, the superiority of the Stoic doctrine of the brotherhood, of the Christian doctrine of the common fatherhood of God. Any Christian reader I may have must not suppose that I am charging his modern writers and preachers with hypocrisy. They do persuade themselves as a rule of the truth of their claims, but surely the plain facts of history evince that they have been either a lamentably scanty knowledge of the subjects with which they deal so dogmatically, or a sense of proportion which renders their judgment useless. This is illustrated again in the controversy about the abolition of black slavery. A whole literature has been written about it, and in the dust of the controversy, the churches contrive to divert the attention of their followers from their immeasurable guilt for the initiation and long continuance of the crime. It is emphasized that an English churchman, Mr. Wilberforce, was one of the great figures in the abolition movement. If the name of a single clergyman, 1 in 20,000, occurs in the early annuals of the movement, he, not the 19,999, represents Christianity. The honorable part bore by the Quakers and many of the Unitarians of America is stressed, and it is concealed that the church folk of the 100 years ago would, if they had had the power, have burned these men at the stake as apostates from Christianity. Lincoln, Lloyd, Garrison, Lincoln, Lloyd Garrison, and all the prominent figures in the movement are represented on worthless evidence to have been actuated by Christian belief. The final stage of the movement, when certainly large bodies of Christians supported it, is taken as typical, and the reader is not reminded that every reform movement gets the support of the churches in its final stage, lest one more victory of humanity unaided by religion should have to be inscribed in the pages of history. In short, it is a characteristic controversy about religion: dust, smoke, fire, flat contradictions, and verdict of not proven. What is the common sense view of the matter? First, whatever merit Christianity may have from the last quarter of the 18th century onward, its action cannot alter or atone for its colossal guilt during the preceding 2.5 centuries, and this has a direct bearing on the general question of Christianity and slavery. It proves to demonstration that the Gospels, the epistles of St. Paul, the early fathers of the church councils, and the entire series of Christian leaders and writers during 1800 years had never condemned slavery. The Christian abolitionist had no previous judgment to appeal to. Secondly, when it is said that the protest which at last arose was due to a tardy appreciation of the true bearing of the Christian message, the claim plainly overlooks a most important historical fact. It was in 1787 that the first group was formed in England to aggregate for the suppression of the slave trade. Slavery was already forbidden in England, so it argues that no moral superiority on the part of England, that it inaugurated the reform. It is always much easier to feel a righteous indignation about the conduct of another nation. But consider the date 1787, 2 years before the outbreak of the French Revolution, 11 years after the American Declaration of Independence. A new force quite different from the Christian ethic had appeared in the world. The same preacher who tells you that the abolition movement was born of a late appreciation of the Christian spirit tells you another Sunday that the French Revolution was born of the opposite spirit. The rationalism of the 18th century, the movement which had begun with Voltaire, had long before 1787 become entirely anti-Christian and humanitarian. It had spread to England, where it gave birth to liberalism, and to America, where it inspired a large number of the leading revolutionaries. This new humanitarianism movement, directly born of infidelity, at once attacked slavery. Whatever one may say about its errors, with which I will deal later, the French Revolution, in its best and almost solidly anti-Christian elements, shamed the long and cowardly acquiescence of the French Church by announcing and inaugurating a series of great social reforms. What a case the Christian apologist would have if the position were reversed, if the initiators of the modern slavery movement had been pagans, if all the slave owners and their priests for 2 centuries and a half had been pagans, if Christianity had then appeared about the middle of the 18th century and its appearance had been followed by the birth of the abolition movement. We can imagine the eloquence, the scorn of opposition of the Christian writers, if that were the historical situation. But because the new spirit which did appear in the middle of the 18th century was rationalist humanitarianism, the role of logic are reversed, and we are told to believe that this new spirit had nothing to do with the abolition movement which followed. Cottonmouth. Hydrate. These broad truths are more helpful than heated disputes about details of the abolition movement. They are undisputed, and they are tremendously significant. They mean a great deal more than does the fact that William Wilberforce was a Christian, one in 10 millions. On the details of the movement, therefore, I will say little, but a few points should be noted. Every religious writer on the subject speaks about Wilberforce, first, last, and all the time. Wilberforce, the devout member of the Church of England. Well, I just opened my old encyclopedia at the name Wilberforce. The point, the point is not important whether for further research. I read that William Wilberforce was very pious as a boy, but that in youth the religious impressions he had received very soon dissipated by a life of gaiety, and that it was precisely at this time that he began to denounce the slave trade. Next, I repeat that Ingram's Slavery and Serfdom is the chief work in England on the whole subject, and that the author makes more concessions than he ought to do to Christianity, yet he sums up, and we quote, "The Christian churches and the slave trade scandalously violated their most sacred duty and used their influence in the maintenance of slavery, the ministers of religion declaring it to be sanctioned by Scripture, and sometimes even encouraging the atrocities resorted to in defense of the system." Page 194. Mr. Brace, the very determined Christian apologist, adds, speaking of the churches of the North, "The organized church in many of its branches became arrayed against true Christianity." A funny sentence that, and the historical facts at the back of it are still funnier. The only branches of the church, which is the church, by the way, which were not arrayed against true Christianity were the Quakers, and, in much less degree, the Unitarians, who were then scornfully denied the name of Christian. Of the American Episcopal Church, then the most powerful in the country, Wilberforce himself said, "She raises no voice against the predominant evil. She palliates it in theory, and in practice she shares in it." Dr. Barnes, a Presbyterian, said, "There is no power out of the church that could sustain slavery an hour if it were not sustained in it." Theodore Parker, who knew, said, "If the whole American church had dropped through the continent and disappeared altogether, the anti-slavery cause would have been further on." At the best, and beyond the shadow of controversy, the American churches were paralyzed by bitter dissensions on the subject. Not only did large numbers of their wealthier members own slaves, but churches did. And what, you will ask, was the attitude of rationalism? Let us first get things in their proper proportions. Rationalists were an exceedingly small body, and not in the least organized. In the early part of the 19th century, they had no corporate funds, no spokesmen, and no societies, and the general public regarded them with suspicion or derision. Rationalism, as such, moreover, has no gospel or dogmas. Insofar as he was a rationalist, a critic of theology, a man's principles did not compel him to work for humanity, while the Christian professes that his principles do thus oblige him. Yet the contrast is eloquent. The overwhelming majority of the Christians were indifferent or hostile. The great majority of the known rationalists were for reform. The entire body of the Christians had contemplated slavery without a murmur, indeed with profit and satisfaction, for 2 centuries and a half. The rationalists of America attacked it almost as soon as they were born. The authoritative exponents of Christianity were the clergy, and in the long list of early reformers given by Ingram, there occurs the name of only one clergyman, but the authoritative exponents of rationalism were generally on the side of reform. The great workers of the abolition movement were rationalists to an extent out of all the proportion of the tiny rationalist body. Lloyd Garrison's children confess in their 4-volume life of him that he had quite freed himself from the trammels of orthodoxy and never went to church. Lincoln himself was an advanced rationalist. The spirit which fought and annihilated the Christian created black slavery of modern times was the spirit which framed the American Constitution and the French Revolutionary Constitution, the spirit of man. That's the end of chapter 4, and we'll call that the end of part 4 of Little Blue Book, number 1127, titled Christianity and Slavery, written by Joseph McCabe. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 5.